Good morning, everybody. My name is David Wayne Jones. I'm from the School of Music here in Cardiff. We've got two papers in this morning's session. The second one will be read by Claire because Laura Möckli is unable to attend for the very best of reasons, because she's expecting a baby in 2 or 3 weeks' time. But she will be joining us virtually on Skype, having witnessed everything online. Our first speaker, for once the usual cliche of conferences, is a true one. Our first speaker doesn't need any introduction. As the editor of the Pater's first full score, modern edition of Carmen, and then more recently a vocal score derived from that same edition, he's part clearly of the continuing history of Carmen and its performances. So I'm not going to say anything more than that.
Thank you very much. Well, we all know that most operas, the essence of, can be written on the back of a postage stamp, but even there the text might vary a little. For Carmen, we might read, oversexed Spanish gypsy uses her charms on a soldier to engineer her escape. He falls in love with her, she falls in love with the bullfighter, and he kills her. A more modern interpretation might be that Jose was probably gay, a pathological serial murderer and a virgin, and Carmen just rather a clever multilingual gypsy, rather efficiently learning the art of social climbing, and for that she has to die. Many interpretations can be justified from different readings of the text, mingling the Mérimée sources with the libretto in part fashioned from them. Note I use the plural, because the novella Carmen was not the only source of the libretto, which also took into account some of the details from Mérimée's earlier encounter with Spain, when he made a visit there some 10 years earlier, reporting back in his Lettres d'Espagne, which contained a detailed account of a bullfight, of a public execution, and expressed his regret at not ever having met a bandit. The popularity of Mérimée's Carmen had been ensured by a well-tried method. The novella was first published in the Revue des Deux Mondes, important as a newsletter reporting on the two worlds of America and Europe. Subsequently, since it was deemed a success, it was published in book form and then incorporated into collections before Bizet and his librettist got hold of it, seeing its potential as an opera based on the established climate of Parisian interest in Spain. While the opera was fashioned for a country well acquainted with Mérimée's work, it was to be exported to countries which neither knew him at all, nor had become interested in a similar way to the French and the English. We often mistakenly think of Carmen as the root of a French enthusiasm for Spanish pieces, Chabris' Espagne, Debussy's Iberia, Ravel's L'Heure Espagnole, and so on. But in fact, Carmen was a stepping stone, exploiting strongly developing Hispanomania in France, shown in diverse manifestations. First, because many of the main Spanish composers of the 19th century lived in Paris, Fernando Sor, Gomis, Garcia, and son and daughter Pauline Viardo, and eventually Albéniz. Second, because amongst the bourgeoisie, Spain became a place to visit, and if you didn't go there, you could collect artifacts, paintings, lavishly illustrated books, and even complain, as Théophile Gautier did, that Spanish stuff on sale in the bazaar in the Boulevard Nouvelle had got terribly expensive, especially castanets, which he apparently practiced. French theatres had several times hosted Spanish dancing troupes, the most celebrated being Lola de Valence, immortalised by Manet not only in his painting of her, but also in his Concert in the Tuileries, where the troupe appears with the Parisian contemporaries. Another important connection to Spain was made by the expansion of the railway network in the mid-1860s. To visit, you no longer had to run the gauntlet of bandits attacking stagecoaches to get there. One guidebook advised you no longer had to make your will before going if you took advantage of the train. Visiting was encouraged by all kinds of travel guides, ranging from elaborately printed illustrated books to simpler volumes presaging the modern travel guides in both French and English. Tourists became everywhere. English milords were portrayed in Gustave Doré's well-known volume on the country as chinless wonders, the forerunners of our future king, chipping off tiles from the Alhambra. It was always Andalusia that represented Spain, the paradise of Jesus, as an old friend of Mary May had told him, he puts it in footnote. This represented Spain. Andalucismo, a movement that turned the whole reputation of Spain into its deep south, was such a powerful force that the rest of the country seems to have been forgotten, except that you could stop off at Toledo on the way to buy, as you still can, some romantic cutlery, that is the navajas, the double-sided knives that could range in length from 3 inches to 3 foot. There's a fine collection in the Museum of Banditry in Ronda, which is not the one up Varley Lines, which also has a couple of nice garroting machines. Andalusia was the place to go. Sevilla, Granada, Malaga, oh, those names make me quiver, Custine exclaimed, one of the main French chroniclers of the region. The French and the English began to flock there, and the stage set for Carmen and its lighting had to look like the blue skies of Andalusia. Considerable efforts were made to achieve this from everyone involved. Apart from the setting, a crucial question is how the relationship between Carmen and José was portrayed, and their characters. Translation and synopses may give us clue. Second, to what extent was the Spanish topos exported or indeed ignored? Was this more the tale of a gypsy from anywhere? And were the essential regional differences retained of José the Basque versus the southern gypsy, amplified in both novella and libretto? Or was this regional difference a subtlety which would not be appreciated by the opera's audiences abroad? Should the audience come out thinking that José should have married Micaela? Or was Carmen the victim of an immature, insecure soldier, not very adept at getting our girls into bed and unable to distinguish between the pleasures of a quick bedding and undying love? It's perhaps pertinent to reflect on the vastly different process of staging an opera in 1875 from that employed in 1920 or even today. At first, there was no concept of a director. There were the régisseurs. In larger houses, quite a few of them. And when the opera was exported, at least in France, the mise en scène was sent along with the opera, sent by the music publishers with the musical score and parts for the régisseur to follow. At least that was the process, but to what extent importers of the opera followed the mise en scène no doubt varied from place to place. It is tempting to view this way of operating as somewhat inflexible, an essentialist approach to the opera, an attempt to fix its interpretation. But I rather suspect this was far from the case, and that however closely the mise en scène were followed, nuances of interpretation could vary the show considerably, not only because of how the parts were sung, and most of all how the principal played their parts. I have included a summary from the handouts. Yes. Yes. I have included a summary from Larousse of how régisseur operated on your handouts, which is coming round. Whatever happened abroad, there is no doubt that the Spanish element was preserved in French productions and even reinforced both scenically and musically. Everyone worked to ensure that the Spanish topos came to life and to realise Mérimée close eye for significant detail, continued by the librettist who amplified his observation of actuality, for instance, in the accurate ordering of the procession into the bull ring in the final act, the quadrilla, in the hiring of an expert painter of military uniforms, Edouard Détail, to design the costumes for the Gardia Civil. Musical differences were also employed to reinforce the local colour. In the 1911 recording from the Opera Comique, which may well preserve something of how it was done in the first runs, Escamillo's tune in the Paso Doble prelude is reinforced with a trumpet, an outdoor instrument positioning the central theme in the bullring, where the bandas torinas predominantly played Paso Dobles. These days, it sounds something more like this. Similarly reinforced in the chanson bohème, where it is a clickety-clack of castanets introduced to terrific effect, and even more in the polo introduction to the final act. One or two other details have emerged in editing the new Peters edition. A significant moment reinforced by scholars who have noticed the similarity to a story of Pushkin in which a country girl tired of her lover taunts him by answering his questions only with a low humming of a folk tune, perhaps caused the indication on the score at the beginning of Carmen's tra-la-la interrogation scene, which Bizet marked to be murmured, fredonné. The indication has been lost in every subsequent edition I've seen. I won't impose upon you the loudest recorded version, you can guess who that is, but you can hear how Merentier did it in 1911.
Elle a d'abord fait un mouvement comme pour résister, puis elle s'est résignée et m'a suivi douce comme un mouton. Et la blessure de l'autre femme? Très légère, mon lieutenant, 2 balles à sa fleur de peau. Eh bien, la belle, vous avez entendu le brigadier. Je n'ai pas besoin de vous demander si vous avez dit la vérité. Quoi de l'appareil, mon lieutenant? Eh bien, vous avez entendu? Avez-vous quelque chose à répondre? Parlez, j'attends. Ce ne sont pas des chansons que je te demande, c'est une réponse.
Played you that to give you some idea of how this dialogue worked. although it may not be the same performers doing the acting as the singing. But the care for accurate detail also infected the new sets in 1898, when the old set, a collage which sticks the keyhole arch of Seville Cathedral onto the bull ring, is replaced by an accurate rendering of the curved brickwork of the much celebrated new Plaza de Toros, which dated from 1881, built after the premiere of Carmen. Apart from its 4 distinct settings, the opera transforms all the well-known stereotypes of Andalusian customs portrayed by the many costumbrista painters of the mid-19th century into tableaux vivants. Looking round the Carmen Thyssen Museum in Malaga and other museums in Seville and Madrid, you will find a picture for every scene in Carmen. The scene in the plaza, with some flirtation going on, some trade and a little bit of crime, no doubt. The ubiquitous balcony of Act 2, where majas displayed their finery and maximised their assets. The downstairs drinking den of the Ventas, whose seediness was unsparingly detailed by Mérimée and softened in the opera. The rich smugglers and bandits, the mountains themselves, and finally the triumphant bullfighters' salute. Here's a few examples. Act 1, in the drôles de gens, as the French called them, these funny Spanish people merging in the square. The balcony. There are so many balcony pictures, and the set, all the sets I've seen for the second act include a balcony. This man was particularly important because he was French, and one of the links between the images of Spain, he painted in Spain and took the pictures back, well known in Paris. There's a less idealized gypsy. This guy painted particularly gypsy pictures. And there are the rich smugglers in an inn. And that's a scene from the Ronda Hills. It's a detail, but you see the Guardia Civil in the background shooting at the bandits, and they've got one there. That is absolutely Act 3. And there's the bullfight. So Carmen was not really an opera out of the blue. It was inextricably linked with Spain's own stereotypes of itself. It could almost be called a costumbrista opera. These images were well known in France largely through reproductions, often cheaply copied paintings and sometimes engravings. Most celebrated a bit later were the Doré engravings to de Villiers' account of Spain, first published serially again in the revue Le Tour du Monde, and subsequently transferred into lavish book form in French, English and Italian. Some of the images are fairly well known, but still highly relevant since the French edition of the book was published during the gestation of the opera. That's the most famous picture of the cigarette factory with the kids, illegitimate children of this cigar makers, which is perhaps why we have the children in Act 1. How all this transferred or didn't transfer to the stages of the world will be one of the most interesting yields of our project. In the best case, we might have sketches and production materials, as we do in the rich collections of the Paris Opera Library and the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris. Otherwise, we may have to glean details from reviews, which often, or hopefully, reveal descriptive detail alongside their positive or negative stance on the singers. Naturally, what was done with the spoken dialogue is also of great importance in the exportation strategies. The 1911 recording perhaps gives us some idea of how it was delivered, although there are several uncertainties here. Listen to the smugglers talking about the English in Gibraltar. You have the text on your handouts.
suite. Pour à vous parler, je vous appelle. Les affaires des Gypsy.
Wonderful smuggler's voice.
Oui, oui, voici. Venez.
Oh, trop mauvaises des nouvelles. Nous arrivons de Gibraltar.
Allez vite, Gibraltar. On y va des Anglais. Beaucoup d'Anglais. Je sommes les Anglais. Un peu froid, mais distingués.
Ouais, mesdames.
Patron.
Vous comprenez?
Parfaitement, patron.
Et c'est quoi alors?
Carmen's gypsiness is also a fascinating subject and surely another variable in the export process. There's a story that Mérimée inspiration for the character of Carmen came from a pretty gypsy waitress he had encountered, but more ingredients were certainly added to her character. Not least, we find some descriptions by Cervantes, transferred verbatim. Overall, it was surely a product of his highly informed imagination. As far as gypsies are concerned, he rather puts us off the scent by adding a chapter 4 to his original story when the novella was republished as a book. This chapter had nothing to do with the plot, the story is over, but it points us in the direction of George Borrow, the Scottish Presbyterian minister who befriended some gypsies and wrote a hand list of the principal words of their language. Although Borrow's main study was not published in French, substantial excerpts of it were translated in a review. Better known was Liszt's extensive study, Des Bohémiens et leur musique en Hongrie, which actually ranges geographically much wider than its title suggests. But more central, I think, to the fashioning of the libretto was Heinrich Grellman's seminal study, originally published in German and English in 1787 and translated into French both French and English in 1810. The gypsy of the libretto has many of the characteristics of Grellman's view of gypsy women as lascivious, ruthless and untrustworthy, quite the opposite of Borrow's view. You have some examples on your handouts. Grellman's racist view of the gypsies seems to permeate the Carmen story, even if it's a little toned down. Regarding her eating habits, remember the remark of Don José to Carmen when she gobbles the sweets she buys from Lilas Pastia. Tu croques les bonbons comme un enfant de 6 ans, says José. But how does Carmen's gypsy character come over in the various translations? A key passage is in her meeting with José. In the novelle, there is a more extended dialogue where the narrator, a historian often seen as Mérimée himself, disbelieves her pretense of being a Navarrese. Are you Jewish, perhaps, he asks. The libretto is modelled on this passage, having already described Carmen at her entry as being in exactly the costume described by Mérimée, which she wasn't in the first staging. She eventually confesses to being a gypsy. This dialogue was retained in, for example, the Karl Rosa's hybrid translation, but disappears in the Guiraud all recitative version. Maybe we will discover more devils in the detail, and I'm hoping our project will unearth a lot more about the various translations in circulation and perhaps uncover other composers' recitatives apart from Guiraud's. Apart from the host of translations available in printed librettos or score, many were surely produced for specific performances and never published. Maybe we'll find some. The dating of the opera's original placing raises other questions. The score says 1820s. The first page of the novella says 1830, but everything points to somewhat later. Mérimée's novella dates from the 1840s in the immediate wake of the creation of the Guardia Civil, inaugurated specifically to fight banditry, surely the force to which José belongs. More of them were employed in Andalusia than anywhere else, defending the coast from Malaga to Cadiz, with Gibraltar as a central point. I've remarked that Mérimée's novel is constructed around a parade of significant moments, and the opera follows suit, adding more. The flower is perhaps the most significant of these, becoming twisted by subsequent translations. Looking at the original libretto, it's clear that after her initial entry, Carmen insolently mocks José, even if she has taken a slight fancy to him. She enters with a fleur de cassis in her mouth, insolence distilled. The flower is important. A fleur de cassis was from the beginning mistranslated as an acacia flower, which is wrong, nor of course is it cassis. She wouldn't want to throw a bunch of blackcurrants in José's face. It was in fact a cassia flower, Senna obtusifolia to be precise, the flower of the senapod plant, rather stinky and almost a weed. We know its pod as a laxative. Perhaps Carmen knew the effect of the soldier's diet of hake and potatoes and thought that José might benefit from a pod or two. As for the flower, you could pull off from the wall, any wall in Andalusia, a cassia flower, and probably a laugh was raised because Carmen threw such a common weed at him and he took it seriously. How often we see him drooling over a carnation or a rose, missing the point of this scene. Carmen's mocking in the original is prolonged by the dialogue. She notices that he is working on the chain which attaches the épinglette to his gun. That is, he spends a lot of time polishing his priming pin. Knowing Mérimée delight in such things, when on business as an inspector of public monuments, he inevitably spent his evenings in a brothel, sketching and writing to friends about his escapades. Usually he was only content when there were 6 feet in the bed. So this is surely a sexual reference to José's virginity. The only sexual he has experienced is with La Veuve Poignée. Everyone laughs, especially loudly in the 1911 recording, but exportation of this moment of irony soon became misunderstood, although Francesco Rosi captures it well in his 1984 film. How are the public prepared for the opera? These days, it's inevitably advertised as the sexiest Carmen ever. For example, the Callisto Bayitos production at ENO set in a car scrapyard. I have to say that Carmen, standing among 6 dead Mercedes-Benzes, didn't quite do it for me. But José has a good snog with Micaela, as is the custom these days, not at all the motherly peck indicated in early translations. So I wonder how the opera was promoted in these early runs. Some delving into gossip columns and adverts might yield a clue. Translations of the opening chorus at Curtain Up are interesting to compare. Rory Bremner, 2013. Hot and gritty, streets are shitty, wink at the girls and pinch their arse. Carla Rosa, 1879. See the square is like a fair, high and low, come and go. Times have changed, and there's no doubt that we've got closer to Mérimée original. And what about Carmen's death? The original is the most heartrending. Oh, ma Carmen adorée. How weak is this in the Carl Rosa version? Ah, Carmen, loved Carmen. Alas, no more thou'lt waken. So much for text. What about the settings and costumes? We have plenty of evidence for the original staging, where a great deal of attention was given to authentic detail. Act 1 scenery, as we have observed, was rendered more authentic in the Carré revival, and in Act 2 the original was a slightly rickety balconied structure. How interesting it will be to find anything related to these scenes, the mountains and the bull ring. Time to stop, but a little postscript. 2 manuscripts which I found of the vast corpus of music from which maybe Bizet modelled the numbers in his opera based on Spanish themes. The first, I think I mentioned the other day, published in London but available also in Paris. 3 boleros by Fernando Sor. Fernando Sor is remembered for reams of Rossini-like very difficult variations for guitar. But Liz used a nice word yesterday to say that bubbling underneath was this idea of real Spanish music in Paris. And here is an example, and London as well. This is the bolero, proper bolero rhythm, proper seguidilla rhythm, written with two accompaniments. On the top is a nice guitar part for a nice crunchy young Spanish guitarist. In the middle is the voice part, and underneath is a lovely Alberti bass part, which you can imagine on a square piano in a nice ornamented version which completely takes away all the seguidilla Spanishness. So that's the lady's part, the English lady, and that's the crunchy Spaniard. Second example, just before Carmen, Soriano Fuerte's piece in French and in Spanish, published in France, with the part for the fan notated here. And as she gets excited, you see the fan goes a bit quick.
Thank you very much indeed, Dick, for such a culturally well-informed exploration of the opera, everything from Velasquez to Spanish weeds. We've got time for a few questions, observations. Who wants to go? Yes,
Are the 1883 sets the same as the 1875 sets?
I think so.
Yes,
But-
apart
but
from
The new production was 1880, 1890, 1888.
98. But they did do some,
But the 1883 was a revival.
but he did do some new sets, some new bits, new costumes, but not always.
What happened in between musically is perhaps interesting, that 1875 was this score with, we were talking about it the other day, but with the dances added and the guiro recitatives and the reorchestration. That's 1876, I think, Choudas brought that out. And then the orchestral parts seem to have been set around 1891 and 2. Choudas, the first ones were all handwritten.
But printed first in 1881.
Around then, yeah, I think so.
I don't know much about the Borrow, and I just wanted to ask you about that.
George Borrow.
Yeah.
Well,
Or George.
George Borrow.
Not George.
no, George Borrow. Well, he. I mean, there's a list of about 10 books that he published about the Gypsies,
Okay.
which are all widely read at that time.
And when were they published, roughly?
Mid-1800s, sort of 1840s and so on. The main thing is that quite a lot of these English books, when they had a review in one of the literary serials, the review would quote really, really long sections. And that was true of people like Borrow and trying to think, Washington Irving. So I think that's how they were disseminated. So you don't just look for translations.
Yeah.
Lola.
I also wanted to ask you, when you mentioned how Mérimée found perhaps the original idea with the gypsy waitress, and you also mentioned Cervantes,
Yeah.
La Gitanilla, and I was wondering whether maybe you know more than me about that moment when Mérimée is corresponding with Montijo.
There is
When
an
they speak about that story with the Malaga bandit.
yes, all of those are dealt with in an article of about I think the 1920s, which I can send you. But that's where I first learnt about Cervantes. There's actually a quote in that, direct. It's about her stockings, and it's something which he assembled because he was such a wide-read man and published shelves and shelves of books, even though he had this full-time job as an inspector of public buildings, and seemed to spend every night in the bottle rather than writing, we were talking the other day about a very popular, what would be called a coffee table book by Mario Bois, called Le Trilogie de Séville. And it's actually a wonderful book because it's got many sources, including these sketches from Mary May about the girls in the brothel, and lots of details about well, all kinds of things you don't find elsewhere.
I was thinking just spontaneously about a strand of gypsy pictures in that period that had to do with Salome. And I was thinking more particularly of that famous painting by Henri Regnault, I think it was on the Salon 1870, depicting Salome as a gypsy with really transportable characteristics to Carmen. So maybe part of that discourse crept into the Salome tradition, later on with Gustave Moreau, leading all the way to
I mean,
Wilde
I
and so forth.
have to say that when I look for decent reproductions of these paintings to put up, because I've got them in catalogues and so on, there's a very dodgy website called Pinterest. Some of you may know, because it seems to ask you for your credit card details. But it had the most incredible list of, when I looked up balcony, it actually had about 300 pictures in good reproductions of scenes on a balcony from every country you can imagine, from Juliet onwards. And then it was exactly the same with gypsies, an enormous repertoire of pictures with a sort of link to commentary. So they all crowded with adverts, but it seemed an excellent source.
One more comment, I think, and then we're
Möckli just asked the Solero Flickers and the Soar, are you suggesting that they might actually be melodic sources for certain pieces in the opera?
No. I mean, I think we all know which melodic sources there are because Ralph Locke has done that in some detail. So I don't think we're going to discover any more actual sources. It's just it's a signifier really of the wealth of Spanish music, real Spanish music that was actually Frenchified, but with French texts and possibly published in France and England, because the main visitors were definitely French and English. They were the chroniclers. For some reason, well, it has been suggested, the German were not so interested in coming to Andalusia because they were all bound up in their own mythologies and were not so interested in the south, except that may be disproved by the importance of Vienna.
But there are a lot of song collections that, and actually Spanish composers publishing in Paris, they're not just in the earlier period, right through into the 60s, and the Henry and the Luke, and so it's definitely massively present.
Massively
Yes.
present. It is Hispanomania. Yeah. Right, I should finish that.
Thank you very much. A few minutes while we set up for the next paper. So Claire is ready to read out Laura Möckli's paper. You've got the title there, so I won't read it out for you. A few words about Laura herself. She studied musicology, English literature and philosophy in Freiburg in Switzerland. did her MA on vocal ornamentation in the 19th century, followed by a PhD in University of Bern, continuing that outlook, 19th century recitative, both from the aesthetic point of view, also the performance point of view. Written a number of articles that flow from that on recitative, on singers as actors, and indeed on declamation and the nature of declamation in Wagnerian opera. Currently, she's a research assistant in the Bern University of the Arts. So Claire's going to read the paper, as we said, and Laura will hopefully join us at the end for discussion.
Yes. So, Laura, if you're watching, hello. And she says good morning to everybody. So I shall just do what I can reading the paper. I will try not to chew up the German too much, and then hopefully we can talk to Laura. So it seems ironic that the fate of the archetypal Parisian and southern opera Carmen was largely influenced by a German translation first performed on the 23rd of October 1875 in Vienna. After the controversial premiere at the Paris Opéra Comique on the 3rd of March, Georges Bizet's Carmen might well have joined the stacks of forgotten French theatre repertoire if inspired directors in Vienna and Brussels had not quickly showed interest in reviving the production and exporting it beyond Paris. Already before Bizet's untimely death on the 3rd of June of the same year, Franois Jana, the newly appointed director of the Kaiserlich-Königliches Hofoperntheater, or the Wiener Staatsoper today, commissioned an adapted version for the Viennese stage. Julius Hopp hastily wrote a German translation, Ernest Guiraud composed connecting recitatives as foreseen by Bizet, and many other changes and additions were made to the Parisian version of the score. Overall, this revival was given 469 times in Vienna between 1875 and 1932, providing a point of reference for spectators and critics throughout and beyond the German-speaking regions. Surprisingly, little research has been done on the detailed conditions and reception of a production which undoubtedly had a major influence on the work's subsequent reputation and diffusion. In this project, I aim to evaluate the conflicting evidence in press and archive sources concerning the materials included in this performance to gain a clearer picture of what was actually seen and heard in Jana's Carmen. Next, I will consider the reactions of the Viennese press and public compared to the ambiguous Parisian reception. Finally, I will consider how this German version of Carmen spread beyond Vienna to other theatres in Austria, Switzerland and Germany, and how the work was adapted and received differently in these varying micro-contexts. So, first thing, traces of Carmen in Vienna. At this point in my research, I have not yet been able to travel to Vienna in person to look through all the archival materials. In what follows, I will therefore summarise the information that has so far been made available through prior research and through the help of my colleague, Dr. Livio Marcaletti, on site. The first obvious source to consider is the score sent to Vienna by the Parisian editors Schudins on the 25th of September 1875, just 1 month before the premiere. This manuscript performance score, written by a French copyist, is consultable at the Austrian National Library. In his infamous critical edition of 1964, Fritz Oeser discusses this source in some detail, providing a basis for further research. By no means a simple recording of the Viennese premiere, these 4 volumes document multiple layers of performance from 1875 to beyond 1900, as suggested by the notes, dates and names appearing in the score. Oeser shows how certain cuts, changes, transpositions, performance nuances, etc. can be untangled and attributed, but nonetheless many issues remain uncertain. The initial cast of Carmen in Vienna was as follows. I'm not going to read out anything on the slides, just look for yourself. But of course none of these original names appear explicitly in the score. Rather, indications typically come into play whenever a new element arises. For example, the name Luca is one of the most recurrent personal annotations referring to the Viennese soprano Pauline Luca, who successfully took over the role of Carmen from Bertha Ehn on the 27th of February 1879 and held it for 54 performances over the next 10 years. We have a couple of photos. I think we again have Amaris on the right. And I'm not quite sure what Bertha Ehn is, what costume she's wearing there. Due to this singer's higher voice range, so Luca's higher voice range, certain cuts and transpositions can easily be connected to her rendition. In addition, one finds occasional performance indications such as ritardandi in the Habanera. At bar 31 it says Luca poco rit, or bar 37 it says Luca rit. And allusions to dance moments in the chanson bohème, which give some sense of individual interpretations. I've swallowed one in my head. Most often, however, attributions remain ambiguous, including in the case of several major issues which call for clarification. For example, it has not yet been clarified how and when the extra ballet music introduced for Vienna by Guiraud, reputedly both the Gypsy dance borrowed from La Jolie Fille de Perthes in Act 2 and two pieces from L'Arlésienne, the chorus and entr'acte in Act 4, was actually included in performance. Furthermore, it is still uncertain exactly when and on whose initiative an alternative 9-bar coda was added at the end of the opera, aiming to soften Bizet's original ending, presumably perceived as too stark and unforgiving. And that's a facsimile page from Oeser's edition of this new ending. Finally, the crucial issue of recitatives versus spoken dialogues cannot be settled on the basis of this score. Indeed, although Ernest Guiraud was specifically commissioned to compose recitatives for Jana's Viennese reprise, the performance score also contains dialogue passages in alternative prose form. Whilst many authors and scholars have automatically assumed that Guiraud's recitatives must have been sung in Vienna in 1875, Oeser asserts that the spoken dialogues were done instead of the recitatives. At this point, it still does not appear completely clear which texts were used for which performances during the 1870s and 1880s, but it is already intriguing in itself that both the German dialogue and recitative versions were available and considered viable options in the context of the Imperial Hofoper. This question leads to a second area of inquiry concerning the German text sources surviving in Vienna and elsewhere, which range from Julius Hopp's official libretto version to annotated copies with cuts and changes, to alternative dialogue versions, and finally, new German translations emerging with the work's expanding popularity. This is too vast a field to be considered in detail here, but an extract of Hopp's translations will at least give an impression of the German text here. We've already had two English versions, so now we have Dieser Menge im Gedränge, wie das kommt, geht und bleibt. Okay. Hopp deftly transfers singable rhyme schemes and rhythms into German, struggling sometimes, of course, but overall managing to create a remarkably fluid prosody for such an idiosyncratic passage. Of course, like any translation, this one has its problems, some of which were already addressed by contemporary critics and later challenged by other versions. Yet this version remained largely dominant throughout the German-speaking world and is still the most common basic text found today in theatres that choose to translate Carmen. Although I cannot expect to clarify all these issues with material from the archives, it appears hopeful that a clearer picture might emerge from the various collections of libretti, orchestral parts, letters and administrative documents housed by Viennese institutions. Of course, any further proposals of where to look and what to look for would be gratefully received. So, Franois Jana. Franois Jana was an unusual choice for the job of director of the prestigious Viennese Hofoper. Indeed, he was already the head of another theatre at that time, the popular Karl Theater, which specialised in lighter plays and operettas, which he had successfully led through the financial crisis of 1873 and continued to manage in the following years. In 1875, he finally agreed to take on the Hofoper as well, thereby juggling between two institutions of quite different aesthetic, societal standing and appeal. It is therefore perhaps not so surprising that his first productions for the 1875 season were innovative and somewhat risky endeavours. After optimising the organisational and financial structure of the indebted opera house, reducing administrative costs, increasing subsidies, Jana turned first towards Paris for inspiration, a move certainly indicative of a post-Franco-Prussian War era. First, he invited Giuseppe Verdi to Vienna to conduct his Requiem, as had just been done in the French capital. Second, he arranged for the promising French composer Georges Bizet to bring his scandalous Carmen to the German-speaking public. Despite the composer's untimely death, Jana pursued this plan, commissioning the recitatives and investing himself personally in the staging of the production. With these recent changes in the opera management and the unexpected death of Bizet, the promotion strategy for Carmen was inevitably short and unusual. And this slide gives you a summary of Carmen promotion in the Viennese Press. What I think is quite interesting is that it starts in 1872 in Vienna. So So already before any thoughts arose about bringing Carmen to Vienna, one finds traces of the work in the Viennese Press. The project is mentioned as early as 1872, with announcements heralding the Parisian premiere at the Opéra Comique from September 1874, followed by reviews of the event by foreign correspondents. The first one of those was Paul d'Abrest, who was writing in Die Presse of the 27th of March 1875, who gives a detailed account of the plot with reference to Mérimée's novella, and appreciative remarks about the sensual and Andalusian character of the scenes and music, also drawing parallels between the generically termed Spanish dances and the contemporary French dance scene, in particular the can-can craze, before concluding, however, that, and I quote, "one should hardly prophesy a long career for Carmen." Edward Hanslich in the Neue Freie Presse of the 12th of May 1875 also compares Bizet's characters to Mérimées, noting the psychological simplifications necessary to bring them to the opera stage. In the elaborated version of this review, published as a chapter in Musikalische Stationen in Berlin in 1880, Hanslich dwells on the comparison with Mérimée. While the toned-down version of Carmen suits him quite well, he regrets that the librettist failed to imbue Don José with more courage and chivalry, making him merely a poor young man with a lover's sunstroke. He salutes the audacious innovations of the libretto in the Opéra Comique text, but remains unconvinced by the musical quality of the score, which he calls half art, situated midway between operetta entertainment and the heights of true genius. The numbers he considers most successful are what he calls the Konversationsszenen, such as the opening scene and the second act quintet, as well as those pieces which engage with what he generically considers Spanish local colour. Both reviews are unsensationalist, apparently unfazed by some of the aspects that scandalise the Parisian bourgeoisie. Hanslich pokes fun at the French critic's tendency to decry anything remotely dissonant as Wagnerian, whilst d'Abrest likens the appreciation of French opera to that of French wine, and seems thrilled rather than shocked by the main protagonist's brazen sensuality. After Bizet's death, several articles appeared mourning his loss and celebrating his achievements, but without specific reference to reviving Carmen in Vienna. On the 24th of July 1875, the Illustrirtes Wiener Extrablatt first mentions Jana's Carmen project for the Hofoper, and from the 1st of October onwards, the press regularly refers to the ongoing rehearsals, fantasizing about various possible first performance dates. Through the various press announcements, one can piece together the following information about the production. I'm not quite sure how that relates. The staging was presumably conceived and largely coordinated by Jana himself. The conductor was Hans Richter. The sets were painted by Carlo Broschi, and the costumes were designed after historical paintings by Franz Gall. Finally, on the day of the premiere, a peek preview of the dress rehearsal appeared in the Wiener Salonblatt of the 23rd of October 1875, where the critic W. Frey roughly sketches the plot, introducing Carmen as beautiful, diabolical and fickle, and Don José is a poor tormented soldier brought down by teuflische Weib. Frey also offers insight into the environment of the dress rehearsal, describing the atmosphere as particularly strict. The theatre exceptionally closed one whole evening to allow for a full dress rehearsal, something which apparently only occurred for elaborate ballet productions, with no one attending other than professionals of the theatre and Emperor Franz Joseph I in his box. So, a Viennese dish, Carmen. Although Jana's second pitch was not as wildly successful as his Verdi experiment, Carmen was nonetheless received with general interest and benevolence by most of the critics. And there's a short overview of the critics reviewed, considered so far. In the Illustrirtes Wiener Extrablatt of the 24th of October 1875, the critic F.M. refers to the style of the first act as trivial operetta, confirming the impression of lower-class realism so shocking to the Parisians. Yet, in contrast, the Viennese critic interprets this as a positive feature, full of truth and temperament. Georg Müller's Don José is praised, but Bertha Ain's Carmen is seen as missing something of the demonic sensuality, bewitching qualities that make her credible. This criticism of Ain's tame interpretation is a recurring feature in other reviews as well, and many accounts concur that Carmen only really arrived in Vienna after Lucca took over the role in 1879. One of the more detailed and enthusiastic reviews was that of the renowned critic August Wilhelm Ambros in the Wiener Zeitung and Abendpost of the 25th of October 1875. Although he was struck by the colloquial lightness of the music, he specifies that none of the numbers are of the type found in Balfe's luckily forgotten Les Quatre Fils d'Aimant. Has anybody actually heard of that Balfe opera? Paul's not here, we need Paul. Filled with melodies and that look as if the composer had spent the night in a random ballroom of a Parisian faubourg and then come home to rapidly commit the herd dances to paper in order to insert these sparkling gems into his opera. Ambros describes Bizet's four-act drama as a combination of brilliantly coloured comedy, bacchanalian excess, dramatic pathos and frenetic popular tragedy, with references to Rossini's Barbiere di Siviglia, Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots, and Robert le Diable, Michaela as Alice, and that comes back in the Parisian Press all the time, and Ambroise Thomas' Mignon, with Carmen as a widely demonic relative. He is generally admiring of the production and singers, only regretting that Scaria's Escamillo lacked the Spanish suavity to complement his vigorous matador rendition. In terms of the staging, Ambros' description provides further detail. There's this little thing I don't understand. I'm not quite sure what the FX means, but anyway, we'll get there. The staging can be described as highly tasteful. The costumes... thank you very much. The staging can be described as highly tasteful, the costumes completely authentic, the men's colourful jackets, actual Spanish merchandise, the makeup perfect. Among the urchins, for example, up in the front on the right, a young boy, or rather a girl dressed up as a boy, seemed to have walked directly out of a Murillo painting, while the colourfully dynamic mass scenes were conceived completely à la Meininger. Despite his own enthusiasm, however, Ambros calls the premiere a half success, with reticent applause from the public and outraged comments overheard on the way out. He concludes his review with a quote attributed to Emperor Joseph II after the first performance of Mozart's Don Giovanni in 1788. Wonderful, but not really a Viennese dish, to which Mozart is said to have answered, give them some time to chew on it. Overall, many critics did admire Bizet's chef-d'oeuvre, but found themselves attempting to justify the mixed reactions of the public. Let me conclude by summarising some of these justifications, allowing at the same time to draw some preliminary parallels to the research questions formulated by Dick at the beginning of this conference. How was Carmen portrayed? Clearly, she was perceived as a gypsy in Vienna, very much modelled on Mérimées' novella. Indeed, many of the reviews give as much space to Mérimée as to Bizet. She is also seen as a wild, demonic character, in some ways hardly human. There is some concern that she is not a worthy protagonist of a tragic drama, and she is definitely considered incomparable to any other operatic heroine of the time. While Ain's interpretation is usually perceived as failing to capture the wild and unique qualities of the role, Lucca seems to have convinced most critics in this respect. And of the other characters, Don José is seen as a weak, tragic character, musically well portrayed, but with whom it is difficult to identify. Another reason for public discontent. The addition of Michaela's character is generally appreciated, though some critics feel Bizet did not do her justice with his music. Paris as a model. It's not clear so far as to what extent the Viennese Carmen was modelled on production details of the Parisian mise-en-scène, as I've not been able to locate any Viennese staging material. Jana would undoubtedly have used the stage directions from the Choudin score as rough guidelines, but the references to local stage designers, Brodsky and Gaul, as well as to contemporary German theatre practice, Meininger, suggest that the staging may have been quite different from that seen in Paris. And Spanishness. The Austrian critics remain rather vague and generic, referring to Spanish music or southern warmth, südlicher Glut, although occasionally underlining regional characteristics of Seville and Andalusia. Rather, it is the French exoticism of the score that appeals to the Viennese, the fast and witty conversation scenes, the popular dance tunes, the musical lightness and variety. Yet despite these initial misgivings, this revival of Carmen did indeed gradually conquer the Viennese public's taste buds. It was the version seen and praised by Richard Wagner and reportedly seen 20 times by Johannes Brahms. This production rapidly became part of the Hofoper repertoire and continued to be performed until 1932. Furthermore, it constituted the basis of Carmen's extraordinary travels throughout and well beyond the German-speaking regions, from Vienna to Prague, from Hamburg to Temeswar, and from Basel to New York. Thank you very much. Can you go from Tom? Now I have to Skype, and we just hope it works. So.
Meanwhile, thanks to Claire and a virtual thanks to Laura. I hope we can locate her.
Hang on, I have to remember, we have one password in all these things in this department, don't we?
Oh, I think so.
I didn't show the last slide.
The person whom you're trying to reach is currently unavailable.
Worked yesterday. Laura, are you watching? Are you on your Skype? It's not working. Do you want to call us? Ah, hello. Hang on a minute.
Can you hear us? Herzlich willkommen in Cardiff.
We haven't got any sound. Hang on a minute, Laura. We don't have sound, Laura. Hang on. No. Is your Laura? No, she's on there. She's not on there.
That's for a second behind the cover.
Shall I just hold a piece of paper up?
See all of us, yeah.
We haven't got any sound. Should we try do you want to ring it? Do you ring the connection again?
Yeah.
Doesn't sound. Is your microphone? Oh gosh, I don't need to write this on a piece of paper, don't I?
No, she can hear us.
Oh, you can hear us?
Yeah.
Is your microphone plugged in? Yeah. Can we do it in the other one?
We could ask questions and she could type answers. That's smooth, but
Or I could try, during that time I could try and do it here.
Can she listen to, as you suggest, can
Yeah.
she listen to our conversation?
We'll try and have a conversation. I'll try and call you on my laptop and see if that makes any difference. Okay?
Okay, can we start the conversation? Who wants to go first?
Questions?
can I
Yes,
start?
please,
Thank you
yes.
so much, Lara. Fascinating paper, and I think it's really interesting the use of the word trivial and the description of it as being almost operetta, and yet they still embraced it. And just a little additional point: the English Gaiety burlesque of 1890 actually tours to Vienna to great success, and I could never really understand why the Viennese would have liked this extremely English take on Carmen, but if it's somehow, I'm curious about how they then absorb it into some sense of genre that makes sense, given there's clearly this discomfort with where it sits generically at the start. There's a question in there somewhere.
I think part of that might be another work that was very popular in Vienna in the last half of the century, and that is Strauss's Dead Zigeunerbaron, which has a strong gypsy element, but it's a different kind of gypsy, of course. It's 10 years later than Bizet. It was hugely popular. So to what extent the operetta influences understanding of Carmen, or did Carmen influences Strauss's composition of the operetta, is something that needs to be explored.
I find the way it crosses over from
Yes.
opera to popular entertainment is something that particularly fascinates me.
Yeah.
So,
And one of the commentators here particularly invokes operetta.
Laura is typing.
Laura is typing.
Meanwhile, we carry on, I think.
The figure
Jana, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
indeed.
So the way he shaped the production to emphasise those elements, you think? Ha.
Yeah.
Fascinating. It'll be interesting to see if that bears out in when the production changes over time, if that operetta thing stays as strong as it works towards the end of the century in the context of changing styles around it, like the rise of Charisma and so on. Yeah. I'll stop there.
Laura, thank you for your paper. How much do you have a sense of how much they might have changed the staging in Vienna in terms of just stage instructions, cuts to the music, all of that? Have you had a chance to be able to look closely at, say, the material that's still in the theater? I couldn't quite tell from what you were saying in your paper. Do you have any idea what might be in them yet, or this is completely, you have no idea? I'm just interested to know what might be there.
No, you're not.
I see. Thank you.
Yes, please.
very likely place to find staging materials and especially designs is the Österreichisches Theatermuseum. I know for sure there's a lot of Brylowski and Hermann Burkhardt was part of it, so the threesome that made the scenery. Franz Garo also. You know, the Wagnerian stagings have been preserved.
Just to ask, I was particularly interested in the fact that Viennese critics said that the public liked the fast and witty conversation in the French opera comique, which I don't think is something one would expect. On the whole, people said we want to get rid of it and put it into recitatives.
I think it's a problem her end, not our end.
read somewhere, and I don't know if you, Laura, or anyone here can corroborate, it may have been Everlacom, it's a bit lost in my memory, that at the premiere, so in October 75, the Giro did not arrive in time, and that is why they went with the dialogue. Now, no one's mentioned that, but I wouldn't have made it up. I've obviously read it somewhere. I think in a French language source. And I mean, I don't know if that would have got out into the press, but
Is that in the main biography?
I think that was in the main biography. But I'm not 100% sure. Right. I should correct that in the book. Thank you.
Which then leads to interesting questions.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering whether Viennese audiences were used to things in French. In Lisbon, for example, we had French theatre done in French. And in the 18th century, there was a lot of opera comique in Vienna. I don't know if that continues into the 19th century.
No, not in French.
No.
But the Viennese aristocracy, a lot of them spoke French, of course.
Yeah.
The professional classes and so on, they spoke French. But there isn't a tradition of performing consistently in French. It's in German,
Right.
nearly 100% of the time.
Okay.
Yes, she has. I've sent it. It's not arriving. Okay. Well, we had a little technical hitch, I think. Are you sure your microphone's not muted? No. Okay. Sorry. Sorry, Laura. Okay, so hopefully we'll try, maybe, Laura, when we have our conversation later on today. Oh, hang on, we've just arrived. Right. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I think what would be best if we'll try this connection again at another point. Are you available this afternoon when we have our roundtable discussion? It's at about, what time is it? 4:30 our time? So 5:30 your time. If you're not, don't worry. We're around on Friday as well, so we might be able to do it on Friday.